Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third Modonaut Monday. In this session, we are going to be discussing the shader tree. Over the next hour, we'll be looking at, one second. Forgot to mute my YouTube there, so I was hearing a little bit of an echo. So we'll be looking at the shader tree, how it works, and we'll be exploring what sets it apart from other surfacing and shading systems, and we'll discuss why it works the way it does. My hope is that by the end of this session, the shader tree will be demystified enough so that anyone who has struggled to understand it in the past will be able to have a new appreciation for it because it really is powerful. We're going to start off with some shader tree basics before moving into some intermediate territory. But hopefully this session will lay the groundwork for future Modonaut Mondays that will delve into more advanced workflows. So again, this is going to be very basic. And we're just going to show more than we're going to explain. We're going to explain as we kind of move along, just because I think it's better to show these kind of practices and techniques. As always, I'll try my best to keep an eye on the chat window. So if you have any questions about what I'm doing, please feel free to ask. My only request is that you be mindful of the delay in the stream. So if you ask a question, it's always best to try and be specific because you might be asking about something that I did 15 to 20 seconds ago, and that could confuse me. And I'm only mentioning this because I want to be as helpful as possible. But ultimately, you should feel free to ask anything. Also, because we're streaming, I'm keeping some of the examples a little bit less complex, just so performance on my end doesn't take too hard of a hit, especially with using the preview render. But technically, you should take the techniques that I demonstrate today and translate them into more ambitious shading setups. So let's get started learning about the shader tree. You'll notice here that I'm in the Modo beta layout, and I have a brand new scene here. I have a single mesh item that is empty because you can see the word mesh is grayed out. So straight away, let's go into the shading tab, and you can see I'm in the shader tree view mode. So this right here is the shader tree. We have the render item here at the top, and this is where we're going to be spending most of our time today. Not specifically the render item itself, but if I expand the children of the render item, the shader and the material, and all of the layers that we can add to this section. We might delve a little bit into lights and environments towards the end if we have time, but we'll definitely save these for a future Modonaut Monday. So as you can see, I have no geometry in the scene, but I have a base material here, and if I select it in the properties, you can see we have all of these properties. Now, the first thing I'm going to kind of demonstrate is just changing the diffuse color. And the reason I'm doing this is because Modo is a global shading system or global surfacing system. So if I change this surface or this color to something like maybe a dark reddish pink, and then I just start adding items, like I'll hold shift to create a new cube item, you can see this cube item inherits that color from the base material. And if I just move this to the side and hold shift and create a capsule, you can see the capsule as well inherits that dark maroon or purplish color. Similarly, if we'll just add a torus and maybe a sphere, they're all getting this color. So this is what is meant by Modo being a global shading setup. Other systems, each item or object will have its own kind of material. But you'll see here, if I come over to the Scenes tab and look in the item list, the capsule, the cube, the sphere, and the toroid are all different items. So what if we want this capsule right here to have its own color? What would we do? Well, I'll come over to the Shading tab, and above this base material, I'm going to add a layer. And I'll click on Add Layer, and I'll select Group. Now, that has done nothing, but I'll add another layer. We'll just add another material. So this material is above the base material. So it's overriding it. The shader tree is layer-based or stack-based, much like some of the other systems in Modo, like the procedural stack for mesh ops or the deformation stack. So it is stack-based. So you can see here, this material diffuse color is gray. And if I hide it, you can see the underlying base material. But as I mentioned, I just want this material to affect the capsule. So in order to do that, I'm going to come over to this group. And in the properties of the group, you can see we have item right here. So this is group masking. If I change this item from all, so that it's affecting all of the items, to capsule, now only the capsule is getting this gray material. And of course, we can change this to more of an orange material. And if I change this from hue saturation value to hue saturation or hue value saturation, I can desaturate it like so. But this is how we mask items in Modo. So it's very powerful. There's also polygon tag masking, which is even more powerful in my opinion. You can tag by part, selection set, and material. And this allows us to kind of shade procedurally as well using the material tag mesh op and selection set mesh op. And we'll get into a little bit of that towards the end. So basically, you saw how I manually created a group and assigned the item masking. We can also do that automatically so that Modo kind of behaves a little bit more like other systems. So if I come over to System, Preferences, and then come over to the Mesh Items in the Preferences directory, and then at the very top here, we have Auto Create Item Masks. I'll just check that. And now if I were to create a cone, so I'll just hold Shift and create a cone, you can see this cone is gray. And that's because automatically a cone group mask was created. And within that group mask, we have a material already set up. So I can just change that to a blue color, like so. And I'll just move that off. I personally like to work without them being automatically created. I just think it's nice to kind of create the masks manually. So I'll just come back up to System, Preferences, and turn off Auto Create Item Masks. And let me just create another toroid. So hold Shift, create a toroid, and that's just a reminder that it is inheriting that base material because it's not being masked by any other group. And you might notice that the material is this kind of light green, dark green checkerboard pattern, the little icon there. And then the groups have this red dot in front of them. And the red just represents the masking. In some popular image-based editing software, when you paint a mask, it'll be red. So that's where that comes from. So it's just a nice clear indicator there. So as I mentioned, item masking is only part of the story. We can also create a material mask. So if I select this cube and press 3 for polygons mode, I can select this top face and press M for material. And that will actually give us the polygon set material dialog. And I can just say, I'll call this top _ 001. And I'll just choose a color. We'll just choose yellow. And I'll click OK. And then I'll click OK here. And now the top of this cube is yellow. We can change that here in the material reflectance side tab of the material properties. But what's different about this isn't just because we're now affecting the element within this cube item. What's interesting and different about this is the fact that now I can select other items that are completely separate items. So now I have the sphere and both toroids selected. And if I were to kind of select some of these polygons here, I'll just select these. I can press M, and I can actually add them to top 001. It's pretty nice. That's a pretty cool feature how you can have masks that kind of tag or reference different elements that are part of different items or layers. So that's pretty powerful. Let's undo that. Now I'm going to quickly select some, oops. I'll just press up arrow to select the next logical polygon, and then L for loop. And then I'll press M for material. Or actually, yeah, I'll keep that as M for material, and I'll just call this stripes underscore 001. And I'll make this kind of a bluish color. In this case, the color doesn't matter because what I'm going to do is come over to the shader tree. And in this stripes section, I think I'm going to add a layer, processing, constant. And now we have this black color where these are. And I'm going to actually change that to white. Okay, and I'm going to change the effect of this constant. So it's no longer changing the color. So you can see here in the color bar here, I have 3 values, 1.0, 0.36, and 1.0. And these are the R, G, and B values. So if I click on this, you can see red, green, and blue changing. But if I were to change this effect from diffuse color to something like, let's say, luminous amount, it changes from color to value. So it's either 100 or anything in between 0 to 100, or you can even underdrive it or overdrive it past 100. But I'm going to leave it at 100. And I'm actually going to delete this blue material because I don't think we really need it. And this constant is the luminous value. Or you know what? I actually do need a material, so let me create that back. And the only reason I need this material is because this luminous amount here actually needs a luminous property from the material to actually be affected. So if I come over to material trans, that's material transmissive, and I change the luminous color to, let's say, a bluish color, and I change the luminous intensity to something like 10, and then I start a preview, find this torus. You can see now this is starting to glow a little bit. It's starting to emit light. So I'll change this to 25, a little bit brighter. And I'll make this a little bit lighter, like so. So put up the 50 watts per square meter. And if I come back over to the constant, which is controlling the luminous amount, you can see I can adjust the value. So if I put it down to 50%, it's a little bit lighter. If I put it down to 0, it turns off completely. And then the surrounding materials, which are this this base material, which is the maroon color, it's actually picking up on some of that luminous color. So if I were to change the specular amount to 0, it will actually not kind of reflect any of that, the light coming from the luminous polygons or the luminous stripe. Okay, so with that said, let's go back to the default view. And quickly talk about selection sets. So if I were to, actually, it's probably best to make a new scene really quickly because it'll be a cleaner way to explain this. We just close the scene. And I'm just going to create a unit plane. And I'll just subdivide this a few times with faceted mode. So Shift D, click OK. Let's repeat that maybe 1 or 2 more times. That's good enough. Control 1 to bring up my main pie menu and toggle the grid off. I'm going to add a material. So I selected all of the polygons, M for material, and I'll just call this plane. And I'll change the material to this greenish color. So this is a material mask that we have here. So you can see the polygon tag is material. And I'm going to explain why a selection set mask might be better than a material mask in some cases. So I'm going to select these polygons in the middle, and I'll just press M for material, and I'll call this river, and I'll make it kind of a bluish color. Click OK, like so. And then maybe I'll select some polygons here. We only need a kind of thin strip, and I'll call this bridge. So M for material, I'll call this bridge, and select kind of a brownish color, and click OK. Now, I have the bridge above the river, which is above the plane. So if I were to hide the bridge, you might think, okay, well, in this section, I'll see green. In this section, I'll see green. And then when I hide it, I'll see blue in this section. But what ends up happening is if I hide the bridge, we see the underlying base material, the gray. Similarly, if I hide the river, we see the gray. And this is because polygons can only have one material tag per polygon. It's just the way it works. Whereas selection sets work a little bit differently. So if I were to delete these so that, and then I'll reassign this to be the plane. If I were now to select these polygons, whoops. Let me just do it this way. Select these polygons. Instead of pressing M for material to assign the river color and the river mask, I'll come over to this button right here, which is the selection set form popover. So I'll click that, and I'll create a new set, and I'll call this river_001. I'll click OK. Nothing happens, but that selection set has been saved right here. And if I come over to the info, statistics, and polygon, we have the selection sets here, and I can select and deselect that river 001 selection set. So why is this important? Well, I can come over to add layer, group, and then add layer material, and I can change this material color to be blue. And right now it's affecting everything because it's above the entire plane. But if I come over to the group mask, I can change the polygon tag type from material to selection set. And then the polygon tag is going to be river_001, just like before. But now if I hide this group mask, we can see the underlying green color, which might be nice sometimes, especially if you're going to do things with opacity. So if I fire off my preview render, and now if I change opacity to 50, you can see the underlying green kind of showing through a little bit. And this is something that doesn't really happen with material tagging because the polygons can only really only contain one material tag. They can't share them. Similarly, if I just select these polygons, instead of pressing M for material to assign a material, I'm going to come over here to this button to bring up the selection sets. And you can also get to it from select, assign selection set. And there's also, you could use geometry, polygon, part. You can also assign a part. And that's another type of tag. It's similar to selection set, but I really prefer selection sets. Let me just undo that. Okay, so I'm going to create a new set, and I'll call this bridge_001. And I have to do this manually, add layer, group. I'll pull that group out of the river and add a material. And we don't necessarily have to add a material if you're not going to use the other properties of the material, like the specular. So I can just undo that and add a constant instead. So I'll just come over to processing, constant, and of course it affects everything. So first I'll just change the color to sort of like a grayish brown. And then in the group that contains the constant, I'll just come over to polygon tag. We don't want it to be material. We set up a selection set. And then the polygon tag is bridge. So I know this is a very basic kind of example, but I just think it really drives the point home that we can now hide the bridge and hide the river, and we still have the green underneath it. So it's not overriding those polygons. At the geometry level, it's really stack based within the shader tree. And Gideon is asking, can we set more than one part tag to a polygon? I don't think so. So let's try it. Let's select these polygons. We'll come over to geometry, polygon, a set part. We'll give this a name. We'll just call this top_strip 001. Click OK. Add layer, group, and we'll add a quick material. Make it red. Right here, group. We have to come over to polygon tag type. Now it's not a material, it's not a selection set, it's a part that we set. And then polygon tag will be top strip. So here it is, it worked, but let's see if, hey, it works. All right, that's pretty cool. So the part is very similar to the selection set in that it will actually allow you to see beneath it. That's pretty neat. Okay, so let's actually start a new scene. Let's do something very similar, but I'll show you a problem that is a little bit more advanced, but it actually this might actually help because you're certain to run into this if you're dealing with displacement maps. So I'll just do something very similar, create a plane. We'll subdivide it a few times. So one more time. No, that's too many. We'll just do this. Okay, so I'll assign a material, so M, and we'll just call this plane, and we'll give it a bluish color, like so. And in the shader tree now, we have the plane material. Let's actually create another, see, I want it to be pretty big. Yeah, maybe not this big. Let me shift down arrow. Okay, so let's make a selection set here. We already have the selection set form open. So new set, I'll just call this square underscore 001. We'll create a new group with a new material. And this group, well, first let's change the material to something just so we can kind of see it. It's yellow, we'll do group, polygon tag type, selection set, because that's what we just created, polygon tag, square 001. So here is our square. Now, let's say we want this yellow color to be exactly like this blue color, but we want the other properties other than diffuse color to be different. So we want these two colors to match. We don't want it to be yellow anymore. Instead of remembering the RGB values, you can always just right-click in the channel section and click copy. And then in the other material, just right-click in the diffuse color and click paste. And if you're ever curious to know, where the boundaries are for this, you can always click this GL override button, and that just assigns a color so you know which material you're currently you have selected. And you can always just create a color that's really obvious. This just lets you know what area you have selected. Okay, so I might actually leave that on for a second. And this is only in GL. This won't show up in the actual render. So you won't see that red color in the preview or in the bucket render. So I'll leave that on temporarily. And let's add some layers to give this some, first we'll check out bump. So I'll click add layer, and we'll use enhanced Modo textures. Let's try noise. Lump is always fun. And you won't see the effect of lump until you actually fire off a preview render. So here is the lump procedural. This is a really fun one. So in the properties for the lump, you have frequencies. If you put it up to 4, it'll become a little bit more dense. And if you put it down to 1, it'll become a little bit less dense. So we'll just keep that at about 2, or maybe 3, and maybe 2. Okay, so here we have bias and gain, which is like your brightness and your contrast. So if you were to increase the bias up to maybe, let's do 75, it becomes brighter. So it's moving closer to, it's biasing towards the white here. And if I increase the gain, which is the contrast, to something like 85, the difference between the white and the black becomes more stark. So we can even push that up to 95. There we go. So if I were to change this effect of diffuse color to, let me see, where is it? Surface shading bump. You'll see now we're getting some bump effect. It might be a little bit hard to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to come to the material beneath the lump, which is where these effects for these layers are controlled. We'll come into the material, and I'll change the bump amplitude from 2 millimeters to 15 millimeters. And you can see now it's really bumpy. But the bump effect, as many of you know, is just a render trick. It's not actually kind of changing the profile of the polygon. It's not actually perturbing or disturbing the surface. And that's what displacement does. So if I change the effect of this lump from bump to something like displacement, now we're starting to really see some effect. We're also getting some tearing, which I'll address in a minute. And if I come over to the options here, you can see draft displacements is on, which gives you faster results, but less. It's not as good quality. So I'll just turn draft displacements off. And that's the effect that you get. But let's actually make this a little bit more interesting. So let me take displacement off, and let's actually go to basic channel, diffuse color. So we're seeing that again. And let's create another layer. So I'll click add layer. Let's do regular texture, noise. So now you'll notice that the noise is above the lump, and they're both set to diffuse color. Since they're both set to diffuse color, the top one is overriding the bottom one. The only way to have them both show up, there's a few ways, but you can change the blend mode from normal to something like multiply, so that they both show through, or you can leave the blend mode to normal and change the opacity of the top one, or you can do both. You can change the blend mode and the opacity. But something that I think is really cool is an effect that we can use, which is called texture offset. This is really neat. So if I select the lump effect and change the texture offset, nothing happens until we select the noise and we come over to the texture locator side tab of the noise, which you can also access by clicking the little plus button and clicking the actual texture locator. And here we have a texture offset strength. If I change that to something like 1, then some of the lump will start to influence the noise. And this is how we can get some really custom sort of effects. And now, if I were to change the noise to displacement, we're getting a much different effect than if we had just had noise. So we have this kind of stucco, crusty effect here. Now I can also come back to this lump, and I can still change things like, if I come over to the texture layer, we can change the frequency down to 1. And I can change the gain up even more, something like 98, so that it becomes even more contrasty. And then if I come over to the material that's controlling it all, we can change the displacement distance from 20 millimeters to 40 millimeters. We just double that. We can change it to anything really, but the reason I'm changing it so that it's higher is so this gap is really evident. This gap right here, this is literally the displacement distance. It's the difference or discontinuity between the material that's being displaced and the material that's not being displaced. So let's talk about how we can fix that. We can use a weight map to fix that, which is a pretty handy way to fix it. So I'll just go back to my standard default mode. And this is where this GL override really comes in handy, because if this wasn't on, I would have to find the boundary. And with it, it's very easy to find the boundary. I can just select these polygons, hold Control, and click Edges. And when you hold Control, the Edges button turns into boundary. So there we go. I can turn GL override off, and now we have that nice boundary. I'll come over to Vertex Maps, and under Weight Maps, I'll create a new map. And we'll just call this, let's do square underscore boundary. And I'll click OK. And that doesn't do anything, but if I have it selected and I hold Control 2 and check out my VMap, you can see that weight has been added to those selected edges. And the red means that it's 100% influenced, and this grayish green color means that it's 0% influenced. So let me press Control 2 and go back to the default, and I'll fire off a preview render. The gap is still there, but now that we have this square boundary weight map, what I can do is I can, above this noise layer, I can add, let's see, a vertex map texture. So if I click on that, I'll pull that in here. It's set to diffuse color, so that's why you're seeing this black and white. And if I come over to properties, it automatically found that recently created vertex weight map, which we named square boundary. But now if I were to drag this into or on top of the noise, see it's set to diffuse color, but if I drag it onto the noise, it actually becomes, if I click the plus button, a layer mask. At the moment, it's inverted. So if I just click the invert button, which is part of the vertex map texture, you can see now it closes up those gaps. And what it has actually done is, let me see if we can actually see it by coming over to Effect, Shading Effect. Let me see if Layer Mask will work. I'm actually not sure if it'll work. No, it doesn't work. Okay, so let's just go back to the final color output. What it's doing is the displacement is having no effect on those edges. It's only having an effect within the boundaries. But you'll notice that this isn't perfect because we now have a clear kind of line here, which I don't think anybody wants that effect. Even though it's gotten rid of the seam or the gap, we have this clear line now. So one way to get rid of that is with another vertex map. So all I need to do is come over to the standard viewport and click GL override, select those same polygons, but this time shift down arrow so we have a smaller kind of selection. Turn off GL override, and we're going to add another weight map, but this time it's going to be based on these polygons. So with the vertex map tab selected, we'll click new map under weight maps, and we'll call this square inner, and click OK. And again, if I hold Control-2 and check out the VMap, now those selected polygons have full 100% weighting, and the outside has 0 weighting. So now, when I click Default and go back to Preview, we can click Add Layer, and we can do Processing, Vertex Map Texture. Here's our vertex map. It looks like this time it didn't click the right vertex weight map, so I can just click here and choose Square Inner. Now it is set correctly. And instead of doing a layer mask like we did previously to mask the noise displacement, we're going to change this vertex map texture to group mask. And I might need to pull it into the actual square. As a matter of fact, I know I do. Or do I? So I'll click Diffuse Color, and I'll change that to Shader Control Group Mask. Yep, so that does it. So now we don't have that that line that we saw earlier. And if I hide the group mask, then the line comes back. So it's catching light a little bit differently because it's ramping up to the displacement. So having that group mask should help a little bit when you experience those gaps. So one other quick thing before I move on from this, I just want to show that there's another way to create the layer mask. So if I pull the layer mask out so that it's no longer a child of the noise, so that it's no longer fixing the gap issue, I'll just hide that so we see the gap again. Instead of dragging it onto the noise, you can always just change the effect to layer mask and then just drag it underneath the noise. It should have the same effect once I make it visible. I prefer dragging it on top because it becomes a child, and then I can collapse the noise, and then it just kind of keeps a much tidier shader tree. But then I'll just make this group mask visible again to get rid of those lines. And we can come back to the shader tree, and let's just, for the heck of it, let's just put a stripe through this just to see how it affects the displacement. So I'll just create a new selection set, click New Set, and I'll just call this new underscore stripe underscore A, because why not? Click OK. And then within this plane, I'll add a layer group, add a layer processing constant. I'll drag the constant into the new group and drag the group above the square. Of course, the constant is controlling everything, or it's overriding everything because it's above everything, and the group that the constant is within isn't masking anything. So first I'll change the constant color to something like red, maybe a dark red. So I'll change hue saturation or hue value saturation to hue saturation value, make it darker. And then I'll check this group, and we don't want it to be material. We want it to be selection set, polygon tag, new stripe. And now when I fire off a preview render, we can see the stripe is going straight through that displacement. So that is just using a few of the things that we've learned quickly to create a pretty cool effect. And I've found that just learning the shader tree, it's just fun to kind of rearrange things and see what happens. So if I were to pull this new stripe into the square, then it will just exist within that square selection set. And similarly, if I were to pull that beneath the square, like so, then it will exist on both sides of the square, but not throughout the square. So definitely worth playing around with. Okay, so it might be a good idea to kind of switch gears and kind of have a look at gradients, because gradients are a really powerful feature within Modo's shader tree. So I'm just going to come over to scenes and create a new scene. And here we go. I'll just create a plane again, and this time I'll just I'll facet this, subdivide it, Catmull-Clark style this time. Click OK. Bevel this in like so, and I'm just going to deform this and make it perfectly round. Shift down arrow to select the center, radial array, or not radial array, but radial align that, and then Shift D, and we'll subdivide it one more time, and that looks good. So Shift Tab to go into Catmull-Clark mode. I'll just change the scale of this a little bit, and I'll turn symmetry on, just doing a little bit of quick modeling. I'll make symmetry in the Z, and then we'll look at this from the right side. Control E to bring up the bend tool, click in the viewport, and just curve that up just a little bit. And this is going to be really just a quick, we're making it a potato chip or a potato crisp. So we have this plane, I'll just rename it chip, and I'll delete the empty mesh item, get rid of the symmetry popover, and in the shader tree, we have nothing yet, so I'll just select these polygons, M for material, and I'll just call this chip, and we'll give it kind of like a yellowish color, like the inside of a potato. Okay, so if I fire off a preview render, right now we're not looking at a whole lot. It's just very flat. If I were to, say, make this double-sided, so at least we can see the bottom and the top, let's actually add gradient. So I'll click Add Layer, Processing, Gradient. And the gradient is cool. By the default, it comes in as diffuse color. But the gradient actually allows us to add a gradient, and actually the sky's the limit with the gradient. Let's actually have a look at what we can do with this. I'm going to set its effect to diffuse amount, and then I'm going to press Alt spacebar. So I bring up my lower viewport, and I'm going to change my lower viewport to the graph editor. We have a mini graph editor here, which is really powerful, and I can click Edit Gradient, and that brings up the gradient. But I just like having it right here in the viewport. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply some value here using the gradient. So with the gradient selected, I already have value in the channel directory selected. So I'm going to middle mouse button click on 100% here in the graph editor or gradient editor, and that creates a little point. And I'm just going to make sure that the value for that is, we'll make it 0. And if I select both of these, I can change the kind of interpolation between the points. So at the moment, we're having like an ease out and then a slope and an ease in. But if I change that to linear, it gives us a straight linear kind of interpolation there. Also, let me check this. We have to figure out how we're going to have this gradient affect the surface. Right now it's set to input parameter incidence, which we don't want. Let's actually go back to our chip surface, and in the vertex map, we should have a UV map. So here's the UV map. It's not perfect. I might just double click that and come over to the UV tools and just fit it really quickly, just so it fits a little bit nicer. But this does have UVs, and if here's the U direction, left to right, and here's the V direction, up and down. So that's going to dictate our gradient input parameter, because what we're going to do is change the input parameter to sample parameters, texture U. And straight away, you can see this side get a little bit darker. Now, if I actually select the value, if I move this, you can see the darkness kind of moving from right to left. So this is how, oops. This is how the gradient editor is directly responsible for how the shading looks here. So I'm just going to put that back down to 1, like so, because we're actually going to use a driver to remap this value, this luminance value. But also, I just want to make sure that my gradient is using, because I don't think it was, I want to make sure it's using the UV map that we have, because that's the whole reason why I brought up that UV map. And let's see. It's using the UV map, and we just have to make sure it's actually targeting that texture. And so now it should be a little bit more obvious. We have darkness here, and if I drag that down, the darkness kind of eclipses the entire surface. So we also don't want this to be just from 0 to 1. We actually want it to repeat. And that's what's cool about this gradient texture locator. We have horizontal and vertical repeat, and we know that the U direction is horizontal. So if I increase this to something like 15, we get this black to white pattern. So I can put that down to something like 9. But I actually think maybe something like 12 might be pretty good. Okay, so let's create another gradient on top of this. So processing gradient, I'll drag that right on top there. And it's set to diffuse color, so it's not overriding the diffuse amount. But if we set this diffuse amount to shader control driver A, this is a really powerful combination using gradients with drivers. The driver is what actually allows you to remap it to another gradient, because if I come over to this top gradient, the input parameter, just like the previous gradient, is set to incidence, but we have the option to have it target, let's see, shader control driver A. So now the output of this gradient, everything that this gradient represents, that repeating black to white, those lines, are actually getting fed into the input of this gradient. So now when I adjust the this gradient's value, let's come down to value, it's going to have a profound effect, which I'll demonstrate. So I'll change this from diffuse color to displacement, so the effect is really obvious. I'm just going to middle mouse button click to create another node, and then I'll drag both of these down. Let me just select both of them. Middle mouse button click and drag them down to set them to 0. I'll select, or middle mouse button click in the middle, and then I'll drag this up. And you can see we're starting to get some ridges. I think it's a really cool effect. I can bring this all the way up to 100. It'll get pretty extreme. And we can actually select these, and we can make these linear as well. So if I click the button to make it linear, you can see it should update, and this is the kind of effect that we get. So now we're modeling with the gradient editor. This curve actually acts as the profile for chip. So if I were to kind of right click and, oops, not this, just this top one, right click and drag this over, and middle mouse button click to create another, and just drag this up, And let's see, maybe I want this one to be 55, and I want this one to be 45. And I still want these both to be linear. Now it might be a little bit difficult to see. We have a little tiny plateau up here, which is nice. And the valleys are still at an angle. But if I were to middle mouse button click and change this to 0, and change this to 5, and middle mouse button click here, change this to 95, and make sure that this is 0. So now we have more points, and I can just make these linear. Now we're no longer kind of in potato chip territory. We're kind of more in corrugated roofing territory. But now you can see we have a little tiny plateau here at the bottom in the valley, and at the peak we have a plateau here. And if I go back to my 3D viewport, it's still just all flat polygons. So this is a total rendering trick. This is only happening at render time. So if you wanted this to be actual geometry, I'm not going to do this now because it'll definitely take a minute, especially with me sharing my screen. But if you come over to render, bake geometry cache, it will actually triangulate this into a dense mesh that you can actually edit and retopologize. So that's definitely an option for you. That's render, bake geometry cache. And what else is nice is that we can take different geometry. So if I were to go over to the scene and just press N for new mesh item and totally obliterate this chip mesh item so that there's nothing in the scene, I can then come over to create and hold shift or hold control in this case. And I'll hold shift and just click plane. And then Shift D to subdivide this. I'll just do a faceted subdivide a bunch of times. I'll delete this empty mesh item. So now we have a plane. All I would need to do is tag the polygons of this plane with the chip group. So M for material. I'll click chip and click OK. Now if I come over to preview render, now we have the same kind of setup here. And let's just around a little bit more. We'll just change the material really quickly to something that's a little bit more blue, like so. Come over to scene, open up the modeling tab. I can always come over to the polygon tools and just give this a quick thicken, like so. And maybe see, just I don't want to do too much modeling here. The whole point is just to show you how robust this is. Now it has broken a little bit. Let me ease up on that, and let's try something. I could also, oops. I could also come over to the shader tree, and we can select this gradient, select the value, and it might be these extra points, which we can just get rid of. And I can move this back to 100 value and 50% input. And I can turn this back into a kind of rounded kind of object. And what's nice is that I can always come back to the original gradient. And in the texture locator, we don't need 12. We can just do 7. I was going for kind of a raft effect, but we are getting some tearing. That's probably from the displacement, which we know how to kind of fix now. I don't think I have time to kind of create a weight map for that because I want to move on a little bit. But that's definitely something that we can address. So I think the last thing that might be worth talking about is maybe the surface. But yeah, so it looks like one of the guys from Pixel Fondue was saying it's breaking at the UV seams due to displacement. Yeah, so that would be a case for creating the weight map and then assigning that as a vertex weight map layer mask. Okay, So let's just create a quick scene. We'll just create one more plane. I'll just subdivide that a bunch of times, maybe some more. And let's just sculpt it up a little bit to give it some interest. I'll just turn on emboss, which just moves the geometry along the normal, which is pretty nice. And smooth that out. Okay, so select those polygons, M for material. Just make this a greenish color. And I think this is really worth seeing just because it's a little bit, it's something that you'll probably want to use. It's pretty cool. So I'll press F6 to bring up my preset browser, and I'm already targeting my mesh directory here. So I'll click this mesh, which is something that I think we built in one of the previous Modonaut Mondays. I'll just scale this inward so it's very small. And we're just going to create a quick surface generator. But first, this is another really cool feature of the shader tree. So whenever you bring something in from the preset browser, especially a mesh, you get this extraneous kind of useless material group. If you have a bunch of material groups that you're not using in your shader tree, and they're not being assigned or targeted by any polygons, they're just not being tagged at all, you can come over to Item, Scene Cleanup, and then in this dialog, you can click Purge Unused Materials and watch this thing go away. Click OK, it goes away. So sometimes when you're bringing in a lot of presets, that will actually clog up your shader tree. Okay, so I'm going to actually make this a little bit smaller, actually. There we go. And I'll just hide it because we don't need to see it. So then in the shader tree, I'm just going to add, let's see, a surface generator. And in the standard item list, I'll just add a replicator. Here we go, replicator. And in the properties for this replicator, the prototype will be my abstract part that I brought in from the preset browser, and the point source will be the surface generator. And you can see these little boxes represent the abstract part. If I press O, and under drawing and control, replicators is set to none, and that's why they're showing up as bounding boxes. I can set it to all, and then we'll see those little pieces show up. But for performance, it's probably a good idea to keep it as none. So there we go. Now, if I were to select my plane and start polygon or painting these polygons with paint select, just selecting some of these polygons here, I'm painting where I want these sort of abstract parts, the replicas, to kind of collect. So this is something that's really, you'll probably use a lot. So I'll come over to vertex maps, new weight map, and I'll just call this replica replicas, and click OK. Probably not the best name, but there it is. If I hold Control-2 and bring up the VMap, there you can see where we had the polygon selected is red, which is 100%, and where it's gray-green, 0%. So now, if I come over to the shader tree, on top of this surface generator, I can add a layer, and I'm going to add a vertex map texture, and I'll just set the effect of this vertex map texture to, let's see, surface particle generation, surface generator density. And then if I press O and turn replicators to all, you can see they're only kind of clustering in those red areas. And if I come over to the actual replicator and let's see, right now the render density is 100%. I could just increase that to 200. Oh, that didn't do it. Let's see. You just check out. Oh, you know what? I can come over to the surface generator and 1 second. Let me just make sure I have that surface generator selected. Average spacing is 100 millimeters, so there's 100 millimeters between both of them. If I increase that to 300 millimeters, there's less, and if I decrease it to 50 millimeters, there's more. So that's how I would control that. 25 millimeters, they're really starting to cluster up there. So default. And at the moment, these all have that gray material and they're overlapping. So you can control that with the average spacing. But if I were to really quickly, I know we're running low on time. If I were to select that original item and select its polygons, M for material, and just call it abstract underscore part, and give it a color. We'll just make it bright pink, just so it's super obvious, and click OK. Whoops, almost lost my Modo window there. You can see now it is really obvious what's happening. So the shader tree really, it's great for shading and surfacing. It can help you modeling. It can help you distributing objects. So this was just not even the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there is so much more you can do with the shader tree. I hope this kind of just whetted your appetite so that, in future Modonaut Mondays, we can really do deeper dives. So that about wraps it up for today. We're running a little bit late. I know I didn't get to as many questions as I would have liked to. I hope you guys were talking in chat. Yeah, stay tuned for more Modonaut Mondays. On behalf of Foundry, I'd like to thank everyone for joining me. Also, if you're going to SIGGRAPH next week, be sure to stop by our Foundry booth to say hello. If you don't do it, I'll be offended. And if you can't make it to SIGGRAPH, stay tuned to our Facebook page. We'll be doing some live streaming from SIGGRAPH, along with Greg Leuenberger from Pixel Fondue, which should be really cool. Yeah, so on Facebook, we are at thefoundry.modo. On Twitter, we are at FoundryModo. On Instagram, we are FoundryModo. And for more Modo videos and quick clips, check out our Modo Geeks TV YouTube channel. And yeah, if you ever have any questions about Modo, please email us at modo.help@foundry.com. So I'd like to thank everyone. Enjoy the rest of your August, and I'll see you guys next time.